bases, and I told you, and we have stopped at the neutralization process. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes. So in that particular screen, I am showing you that when HCl interacted with sodium hydroxide, NaCl is produced and water is produced. And if at all you write the balanced equation, you can see that the sodium ions which is present on the right hand side as well as the left hand side underwent cancellation. The chloride ions also underwent cancellation, and what is left out? Only the H plus ions and OH minus ions is left out, and those two only interacted among themselves, and finally it produced water. So, as per the Arrhenius theory of acids and bases, neutralization is a process in which H plus ions and OH minus ions will interact and will produce water only. So we need not worry about whether salt is formed or not in any neutralization reaction as far as the Arrhenius concept is concerned. Okay, let us go through the limitations of Arrhenius theory. Substances are defined as acids and bases only in presence of water. Hence, it is applicable to water medium and not applicable to non-aqueous and gaseous medium. For example, you take HCl. So HCl, when you put it into water, then only what will happen? HCl will undergo ionization and produce H plus ions and Cl minus ions. So since HCl is producing H plus ions in water medium, we call HCl as water and as an acid. That too in what medium? In water medium. Suppose you take the same HCl and put it in benzene. Will HCl undergo ionization? It will never undergo ionization, even though HCl is containing H plus ions. So HCl can be called as an acid only in a water medium, and it cannot be called as acid in benzene medium, even though HCl is having a H plus ion. The same is the case with our sodium hydroxide or base. So a base will be called as a base only in water medium and not in our non-aqueous medium. So Arrhenius theory is only applicable in water medium only and not used Jordan's here for studies in non-aqueous medium. Second point you see, it cannot explain the acidic properties of copper sulfate, aluminum trichloride, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide. Okay, you people know that carbon dioxide, when it is dissolved in water under pressure, you get water carbonic acid. In the same manner, sulfur dioxide, when it is introduced into water, then what will happen? It will interact with water, and you are going to get sulfuric acid as well as your sulfurous acid. Is it clear? But even though all these things we are able to observe, but Arrhenius theory will not explain anything about the acidic here nature of the carbon dioxide as well as the sulfur dioxide. Why? Because according to Arrhenius theory, the substances which contain H plus ions, which releases H plus ions in aqueous medium are considered as what? As acids. But if at all you see carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide, it doesn't contain H plus ions or hydrogen is not present. And if such is the case, if you put this carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide, will H plus ions come from carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide? It will not come. As a result of which, what will happen? According to Arrhenius concept, carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide are not at all considered as acidic substances, even though you know that carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide, when dissolved in water, produces what acids? Carbonic acids and sulfurous acid and sulfuric acid respectively. Okay. Next, you see copper sulfate. Copper sulfate is there. Copper sulfate doesn't contain attention H plus ions. But when copper sulfate is added into water, what happens? It dissociates to produce what? Copper ions as well as sulfate ions. And these sulfate ions, in turn, it will interact with the water, and you are going to get what? Sulfurous acid and sulfuric acid. Is it clear? But as of now, copper sulfate doesn't contain hydrogen, and if it is dissolved in water also, no hydrogen ions are going to come from copper sulfate. As a result of which, we cannot explain the acidic character of copper sulfate using your Arrhenius theory. Now let us go to the basic properties. Arrhenius theory will not be able to explain the basic properties of sodium carbonate. Then next what? Your amines and ammonia, pyridine. Okay, as they do not contain what? OH minus ions. You know ammonia. Okay, is a base garden here in nature. But ammonia If but ammonia is not containing OH minus ions. But Arrhenius theory, what it will tell, any substance which contains OH minus ions only will be considered as what? As a base by Arrhenius theory. But here ammonia is not containing OH minus ions. Okay, as a result of which you cannot call ammonia as a basic as per the Arrhenius theory. In the same manner, in organic chemistry, you have studied pyridine as a basic condensate substance. Why? Because in pyridine you are having the nitrogen atom in the benzene ring, and that nitrogen atom will be having what? A lone pair of electrons, and these lone pair of electrons is responsible for what? For the basic character of pyridine. Is it clear? But since pyridine is not having OH minus ions or OH groups, this pyridine here will not be considered as a base by our Arrhenius theory. Is it clear? Hope the point is clear to you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Now let us go to the next point. It does not consider the role of solvents in deciding the strength of the acid and the base. Is it clear? What does that point mean? It does not consider the role of the solvents. Already I told you this point. You take carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide doesn't contain H plus ions, okay, or hydrogen. So as per the Arrhenius theory, it is not acid. But what you do? You took that carbon dioxide and you poured that thing, or you introduced that carbon dioxide gas under pressure in water. And in water medium, what happened? This carbon dioxide interacted with the water, and finally carbonic acid is produced. So since carbonic acid is produced in water, you say that carbon dioxide is having what? Acidic character. Okay, but that is not at all, let us see here, useful for the Arrhenius theory to say a particular thing is having a acidic character. So that means it is not at all, let us say, supporting, it is not at all, let us say here, taking into consideration the role of the medium, the role of the medium. If Arrhenius theory would have taken into consideration the role of a medium, then naturally carbon dioxide, we have to call carbon dioxide having what character? Acidic character as per the Arrhenius theory is concerned. Is it clear? The same is the case with ammonia also. Ammonia is there. Ammonia is not having OH group, so it is not base. But when ammonia is dissolved in water, what happened over there? It became, it interacted with water, and it got converted into what? Ammonium hydroxide. Is it clear? Hydroxide. So as a result of which, the aqueous solution of ammonia is having what character? A basic character. But already I told you that Arrhenius theory is not at all giving any importance to the role played by the solvents. Hence, whatever may be happening in the solvent, okay, because of interaction with the solvent, H plus ions may be produced or OH minus ions may be produced. But all these things are not at all considered by the Arrhenius theory in explaining the acidic and basic character of the substances. Hope the point is clear to you.
Yes, sir.
Now we go for the next point, that is this theory is unable to explain the last point there. This theory is unable to explain the neutralization reaction taking place between HCl and ammonia. As per our Arrhenius theory, neutralization is a process in which H plus ions and OH minus ions belonging to acid and base interacts to give what? Only water. We are not at all bothered with the water, salt, is it not? Yes. So here you are taking two examples. One is HCl and the other one is ammonia. Is it clear? So both are interacting, and finally what is happening over here? What is happening? Are you getting water? Are you getting water, ma?
No,
HCl?
no, sir.
No water. So since water is not produced in this particular reaction, you cannot say that neutralization is taking place or neutralization is possible between HCl and ammonia. This is the problem with our Arrhenius theory. Hope all the points are clear to you, so that we can move to the Bronsted-Lowry theory. Okay, so now 1 minute. So now let us go to the next one, that is wait 1 minute. The Bronsted, let us see here. Bronsted-Lowry theory, you see here. Bronsted and Lowry proposed the definition of acids and bases on the ability of the substances to either donate or accept protons. Is it clear? So, as per the Arrhenius theory, the substances which produce H plus ions and OH minus ions are considered to be acids and bases. Whereas according to the Bronsted theory, any substance which donates H plus ions will be considered as what? As an acid, and any substance which is capable of taking up H plus ions will be considered as a base. So the proton donor will be considered as acid, and proton acceptor will be considered as a base. So I could get some disturbance from your side. So kindly mute yourself. Okay. So let us see over here. Amma, kindly mute yourself. Okay. So you see over here. Now we are going to study this particular reaction. That is a HCl and ammonia. So, but in the previous case, we could not take ammonia for our studies. Why? Because as per the Arrhenius theory, ammonia doesn't contain OH group. So hence, here you cannot take ammonia in the place of a base. But here we are taking ammonia in the place of a base. Why? Because we can see in this particular reaction what is happening, and HCl is interacting with ammonia. This ammonia is getting converted into what? NH4 plus ions, and this HCl is getting converted into what? Cl minus ions. That means what is happening over here? HCl is losing a proton. That means HCl is going to function as what? As a proton donor. So this can be called as what acid? Bronsted acid. Is it clear? And in the same manner, what is happening? This ammonia, it is taking up the H plus ion released from HCl, and it is getting converted into what? Into NH4 plus ion. That means that this ammonia is functioning as what? As a proton acceptor. Okay, so this will be considered as a Bronsted base. Okay, so after accepting the proton, this ammonia got converted into NH4 plus. Very nice. But now this NH4 plus will be called as what? Will be called as the conjugate acid. Are you able to hear? Conjugate acid of the Bronsted base. In the same manner, this chloride ion is called as the what? Conjugate base of the Bronsted acid HCl. Is it clear? So the Bronsted acid will be producing what? The conjugate base, and the Bronsted base will be producing what? The conjugate acid. So why I am calling this NH4 plus as conjugate acid, and why I am calling this chloride ions as a conjugate base is the next question. Why I am calling? Because this NH4 plus ion, okay, is having the ability to donate what? To H plus ions to anybody it wishes. So since it is having the donating ability, this will be called as the conjugate acid. Is it clear? In the same manner, this will be called as the conjugate here base. Why? Because chloride ion is present. This chloride ion means what? What is electronic configuration of chloride ions? This chloride ion, okay, let it say chloride ion is there. Chloride ion is having what? A negative charge is there. So always it tries to attract what? The H plus ions. So since it is having the attracting ability of for H plus ions, this will be functioning as what? As a conjugate here what? Base. Is it clear? So hope the point is clear to you people. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, now let us go to the Lewis concept of the Bronsted acids as well as the bases. Now let us see. So Lewis proposed the definition of acids and bases on the basis of what? The structure and bonding. Okay, so according to this theory, an acid is a substance which functions as what? As a electron pair acceptor, or in general, you can say it is an electrophile. Electrophile is nothing but what? Electron loving species. So any species which loves to attract or which loves to have a more number of electrons will be functioning, will be called as what? Electrophile. So such electrophiles, according to Lewis concept, will be functioning as what? As acids. And the reverse, what is that reverse? Any species which is going to act as what? Act as electron donor. Is it clear? Or which tries to remove what is there, more number of electrons from itself and give it away to somebody else will be functioning as what? As a nucleophile. So nucleophiles will be called as what? Electron pair donors. Okay, and such here substances will be termed as or will be called as what? Lewis bases. For example, you see in this example that is a BF3. Already you know what is the specialty of BF3. BF3 is an electron deficient compound. Boron is an electron deficient compound. So since the boron atoms here is an electron deficient compound, this particular BF3 always tries to attract atoms here electrons. Is it clear? Attract electrons. So something is some species is present, some nucleophile is present by the side by very close to BF3. Okay, you see, think like that. Then what will happen? This BF3 simply I can see here attracts an electron pair from the nucleophile and finally what will happen? A coordinate covalent bond will be formed between the nucleophile and the BF3 with the arrow pointing from the from where? From the nucleophile towards the BF3 molecule. Is it clear? So that means a coordinate covalent bond atmosphere formation will be observed, and the formation of the the coordinate covalent bond also can be explained with the help of the Lewis concept. We cannot explain the formation of coordinate covalent bond formation using the Arrhenius theory or using our branched adency here theory. Is it clear? Okay, because those theories will try to explain only the simple ionic bonds as well as our simple covalent bonds, but coordinate covalent bonds can be explained only with the help of the Lewis here concept. Is it clear? Okay, now you see over here the OH group is there. Okay, ammonia is there. So this is a common example in our inorganic chemistry complex formation. So ammonia is there. So this is going to function as a ligand, is it not? Yes, ligand means what? It will be containing always a lone pair of electrons. So where the lone pair of electron is situated, it is situated on nitrogen. So this lone pair of electron will be given away. So that means this ammonia is functioning as what? It is functioning as a nucleophile. Is it clear? Suppose BF3 and ammonia is present very close to each other. Then what happens? Lone pair of electron which is present on nitrogen will be attracted by what? The electron deficient boron present in BF3, and finally a coordinate covalent bond will be formed. Okay, and the arrow will be starting from nitrogen and will be pointing towards the boron. Is it clear? That means the lone pair of electron flow is taking place from nitrogen to boron. Is it clear? So that is the information we are going to get just by seeing the direction of the arrow. Okay, and finally a coordinate covalent bond is formed and the product which is formed, okay, between Lewis the acid and Lewis here base, okay, that product will be called as an adduct, and when we examine the adduct very closely we can observe the formation of a coordinate covalent bond between the nucleophile or the Lewis base and the Lewis here acid. That substance is called as the adduct. Okay, hope the point is clear to you all. Clear?
Okay, sir.
Okay, sir.
Okay. So let us go for our gravimetry. Is it clear? Okay. So before I go to the gravimetry, let us remember or refresh our mind with what we have done in our practicals. Is it clear? So we have done two gravimetric practicals. One is the estimation of nickel using dimethyl glyoxime and estimation of zinc using our diammonium hydrogen orthophosphate. Okay. So in this particular practicals, what did I ask you to do? I asked you to finally estimate the amount of nickel or zinc present in the given unknown solution. That is the work which I have given to you. Is it clear? So in our volumetric, what is the difference between the volumetric titrations as well as the gravimetric procedure? So in volumetric titrations, what you have done, you have estimated again the nickel and zinc only. Okay, zinc only. But in volumetric experiments, the nickel and the zinc is present in the given unknown solution in what form? In the soluble form only. And with the help of an indicator, what you have done, you have titrated the given solution, and depending upon the volume of the titrant consumed, you have given and using certain calculations, you came to a conclusion that this much amount of nickel or zinc is present in the given unknown solution. But in gravimetry, what we are going to do is we are not going to use any kind of indicators. What we are going to use, we are going to use a precipitant. So what is the main role of the precipitant? The main role of the precipitant is what? It is going to convert. What it is going to do? It is going to convert the nickel ions or the zinc ions which is present in the given unknown solution in what form? In the soluble form. Into what form? Into an insoluble form. That insoluble form, we call it as what? We call it as a precipitate. Okay, and already when I have dealt with the solubility product, I told you that precipitation will take place only when the ionic product exceeds the solubility product. Then only precipitation is going to take place. Okay, very nice. And we should remember one thing. What is that one thing? What is that one thing? The quantity of the precipitant which we are going to add, okay, should be should be added with care. We should not add too much of the precipitant or too less of the precipitant. Is it clear? Okay. The next thing is what? Next thing is what? We have to make sure about the pH of the medium when the during the gravimetric procedure. Otherwise, what will happen? The precipitate will not be obtained, or if at all the precipitate is obtained, okay, it will be present in what form? We cannot we cannot filter through the gauge crucible, and all the precipitate which we have observed will not be available in the gauge crucible. Simply it goes out of the gauge crucible. Is it clear? So that is the thing. Okay. So hope all these things you are able to remember once again.
Yes, sir.
Yes. So let us see the principle. You just see the concentration of the analyte can be determined by forming a precipitate of a definite chemical composition using a precipitant. What is this a definite chemical composition? What is definite chemical composition? So you have taken as a nickel. Is it clear? Okay, nickel. So how did you take nickel? Just you took nickel ammonium sulfate and you dissolved it in water and you have prepared some solution. Okay, of some concentration you prepared, and after that you took dimethyl glyoxime and you have dissolved that dimethyl glyoxime in our alcohol and you have prepared a solution. Now you have interacted this nickel with the dimethyl glyoxime. Okay, and finally you have observed what? A precipitate, a scarlet red precipitate. Okay, when it is formed only in presence of water, in presence of our ammonia. What is the role of ammonia over there? What is the role of ammonia? Its role is nothing but to maintain the pH over there. Is it clear? Okay. So in presence of ammonia or in presence of basic conditions, a scarlet red precipitate is formed. Okay. Now, if at all you see, if at all you analyze the chemical composition, or if at all you derive the formula of that particular precipitate which you got, that precipitate should have what? A definite chemical formula. Okay, if it does not have a definite or constant chemical formula, it will be very difficult for us to define the molecular weight of the precipitate. If that is the case, then we cannot estimate the quantity of the nickel present in the given unknown nickel solution. So the precipitant which you are going to use, okay, that precipitant should interact readily with the nickel ions. Okay, suppose your solution is containing along with the nickel ions, zinc ions are there, magnesium ions are there. Okay, but the precipitant which you are going to use should only interact with what ions? With nickel ions. It should not interact with the the zinc ions or with magnesium ions present in the solution. If it interacts, what is going to happen? The amount of the precipitate which you are going to get will increase, and finally what here the results which you are going to get will be wrong. Is it clear? So you have to select a precipitant which is going to have a specific activity or specific here attraction only to what ions? To nickel ions, and not to any other ions present in the medium. Is it clear? Okay. And the precipitate which is formed should have a definite adensire chemical adensire formula, okay, using which we can find out the molecular weight of the precipitate, and using some calculations, what can we do? We can estimate the concentration of the nickel adensire present in the given unknown solution. So if all this has to happen very easily, then the precipitate should have a definite chemical adensire formula. Is it clear? Okay. So a precipitate is formed when the ionic product exceeds the solubility product. This we have understood when we discussed with the solubility product concept. The resultant precipitate, what we will do after getting the precipitate, we will simply here wash it several times, okay, to remove what the impurities and any other here excess amount of the precipitant which is attached here to the precipitate. Simply all these things will be washed off, and after making sure that the precipitate is free of the chlorides, free of any other impurities, okay, and free of the excess here precipitant, then only what we will do is we dry it, okay, we dry it using our suction, and then here we put it in the desiccator, and then here we go for our weighing here process, okay, and this weighing process will be continued several times till you get a constant here weight. So this is the principle behind our gravimetric here analysis. So in short, I have given you a typical here reaction here representing the gravimetric analysis. That is when A moles of analyte A, okay, present in the sample reacts with R moles of the reagent. What is this reagent? The reagent is nothing but your precipitant. So we have used what precipitants? Dimethyl glyoxam. That is one precipitant. We have used another precipitant for getting for estimating zinc. What is that? Diammonium hydrogen orthophosphate. So these are your reagents. Is it clear? So now this A will react with what? With R, and finally you are going to get what? You are going to get what? And see here the precipitate. Okay, precipitate. That precipitate is nothing but what? AaRR. That is a precipitate. Okay. Now, since one does not know the concentration of the analyte present in the sample, and excess of the precipitating reagent is used for analysis. Okay, so if at all you remember, I told you that okay, first you take your nickel solution, okay, some quantity, some 10 ml or 20 ml you take in your 500 ml volumetric flask, dilute it to 100 ml, and then you heat it. After that you cool it, and then you add dimethyl glyoxam, some 10 ml or 20 some 10 ml dimethyl glyoxam you add. And then what you do, you here you heat it, and then you cool it, and again you add what? Ammonium hydroxide in excess to make the medium basic. Then you will get a scarlet red precipitate. I told like that to you. After that, what you do? Again, here you heat the precipitate. The process is called as a digestion. And I told you after during the digestion process, suppose if at all you are asked to heat 50 minutes, I told you after 50 minutes heating, again you cool that particular beaker, and then with the help of a dropper, you just here add a few drops of the dimethyl glyoxam, and you see whether here any excess amount of the precipitate is forming or not. If any excess here precipitate is formed, that clearly indicates that the precipitant amount or quantity which you have added okay in the beginning, that is 10 ml, is not sufficient. Okay, so you have to add a little bit excess. Is it clear? Okay, but it doesn't mean that To add excess means not to add, you took here 20 ml of nickel solution and add 100 ml of precipitant. That is not what I mean. Is it clear? So a slightly excess here reagent should be present, because you don't know exactly how much here concentration unknown solution I have given to you. Is it clear? So it is always better to add slight excess of the precipitant. Is it clear? So that you have to check here after the digestion process is over. Okay, you add here a small quantity of the precipitant with the help of the dropper, and you see carefully here the beaker, any here fresh amount of the precipitate is forming or not. If a fresh quantity of the precipitate is forming, then that means still you have to add excess amount of the precipitate. Precipitant. Okay, and if that is not, if no excess quantity of the precipitate is not formed, then you can be making you can be sure that whatever the precipitant you have added in the initial stages of the reaction and in the initial stages of the analysis is more than sufficient. Is it clear? Okay. Hope the point is clear to you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So now let us go to the types of the gravimetric analysis. So there are several types of gravimetric analysis, but we are only interested with only one type of gravimetry, that is your precipitation gravimetry. So this is called as precipitation gravimetry. Why? Because in this gravimetric type, we will be able to here observe the metal ion being precipitated out here from the solution in the form of an insoluble here precipitate. That is the reason why we call this gravimetry as water gravimetry, precipitation gravimetry. I shall read out for you. So when the analyte is converted into a precipitate using a suitable precipitant, we call the method as what? Precipitation gravimetry. Example is the nickel. So this is nickel is our analyte. So this nickel, what we have done? We have converted it into a precipitate with the help of the suitable precipitant. What is that suitable precipitant? That is nothing but dimethyl glyoxane. So since this analyte is converted into a precipitate using a suitable precipitant, that gravimetry is called as what? Precipitation gravimetry. Now you go for the electrogravimetry. What is this electrogravimetry? Electrogravimetry is nothing but what you take the electrolysis process. So suppose you want to deposit here this what you can say this gold plated jewelry, okay, often you people use. Okay, so what do you do? Simply you will be plating you will be coating a very very thin layer of gold here on the surface. Is it clear? Thereby that particular ornament looks almost similar to gold, but that is not gold. That phenomena is called as what? Electroplating. Is it clear? So here what we are doing, we are depositing. Okay, for example, you want to deposit gold. Okay, so that means what you will do? You will take here gold solution in the electrolytic vessel. Okay, you take that particular metal or that particular here ornament which you want to electroplate as the anode. Okay, cathode here will be kept as what? As your gold, and you supply here current. Then what will happen? The gold here will be deposited here as a thin layer on the surface of the ornament or on the surface of the item. As a result of which, what happens? It will be getting an yellow luster. Is it clear? So this here gravimetry, where where the precipitate is deposited on a metal surface in the form of a thin film in presence of a current is referred to as what? Electrogravimetry. Hope the point is clear to you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now we go for the thermogravimetry. So thermogravimetry means here what we are going to do. So here also we are going to get an insoluble precipitate, no doubt. Is it clear? Okay, but this insoluble precipitate is produced here under the influence of heat. Is it clear? In the previous case in electrogravimetry, what I did, I am going to get an insoluble precipitate. Okay, in presence of what energy, electrical energy. That is the reason why we called that gravimetry as what, electrogravimetry. So thermogravimetry is nothing but what, some substance or the analyte is converted into what, into an insoluble precipitate in presence of what, in presence of heat. Is it clear? So this thermogravimetry is also called as what, gravimetry, volatilization gravimetry. Is it clear? So example I shall give you to determine the moisture content in the bread. So we use a thermal energy. Is it clear? For example, I am giving you a bread piece and I am asking you that what is the percentage of moisture in this particular bread piece. So what you are going to do? First, you take that particular bread piece, okay, and you weigh it in your analytical balance. Okay, the bread piece is equal to 10 grams. So this 10 grams means what? In this 10 grams, even moisture content is also present. It is not the weight of the bread piece, but it is the weight of the bread piece along with the moisture. Okay, you don't want the weight of the bread piece. You want what? How much grams of water content is present in the bread piece given to you. Okay, so what you will do? You will simply heat that particular bread piece. So when you heat, what will happen? The moisture present in the bread piece will be simply evaporated. Okay, will be simply evaporated. After that, what you will do? You will take that bread piece and you will keep it in the desiccator. Okay, so the bread piece undergo will come to room temperature, and then what you do is you weigh the bread piece. Is it clear? Now the weight you are going to get is 9 grams. You think like that. Is it clear? So what is the difference? It is nothing but 1 gram. So that 1 gram, what we will do? So 1 gram is present, 1 gram of moisture is present in how much? In 10 grams of the bread sample. So if at all you want to express it into percentage, simply 1 by 10 into 100. That means 10 percentage of water content is present in the given here bread here sample. In this way, you can find out here the moisture content of the given bread sample. In the same manner, suppose you want to determine the amount of carbon in a given organic compound. What you will do? Very simple thing. Okay, what you do? You take the organic compound, you supply here, you heat or you burn that particular organic compound. So you people know that when you burn the organic compound in presence of atmospheric oxygen, what will happen? The carbon content that is present in the given organic compound will undergo oxidation process. It will combine with oxygen and it will be converted into water, into carbon dioxide. And what you do is you absorb that particular carbon dioxide into water, into a lime. Okay, into lime. And after that, what you do? You weigh the lime before and after here absorption of carbon dioxide, and the difference in the weight of the lime will tell you the amount of here carbon here present in the given organic compound sample. Is it clear? Hope the point is clear to you. So here what you have done, you have used here some medium. Is it clear? Okay. So here what you have done over here, simply water is released out. Is it clear? This water has to be trapped into some other medium, and that medium has to be weighed. Is it clear? Here no need of trapping, but here trapping is needed. Is it clear? So or you can weigh this particular trapping is also not needed. You can weigh this organic compound again, and the difference in weight also will tell you, okay, how much amount of carbon is present. Is it clear? Okay. So this is your what is this? The thermogravimetry. Hope the point is clear to you.
Yes, sir.
Now we go for the particulate gravimetry. So in this method, generally here this particulate gravimetry is used by the environmental chemistry people, okay, to analyze the particulate content or the suspended here particle content in the atmospheric air or in the air sample. Is it clear? So what they do is in this method we determine the analyte by separating it from the sample matrix using a filtration or an extraction procedure. Is it clear? So particulate means what you will do? You take here the air, okay, from the atmosphere or from your surroundings, and then what you do is you pass this particular air through some sort of a scrubber. Is it clear? Scrubber. So when you pass this particular air through the scrubber, what will happen? The suspended solid particles they get settled here at the bottom of the scrubber, and here, and just by weighing that particular weight here, then you can analyze how much amount of suspended here solid particles are distributed here in the air sample in which you are living. Is it clear? So this is another here work here which is done by the environmental here chemistry people to analyze the quality of the air here sample. Is it clear? And usually here in our here near our what you can say that on the road all they will be displaying here the quality of the air sample. Is it clear? In that also you can see this particular data displayed. Okay.
Okay, sir.
So now let us go for the factors here affecting the gravimetric analysis, or what are the different here points which you have to keep in mind to get here good results in gravimetric experiments. So first is the nature of the precipitate. Okay, the precipitate must be formed here quantitatively. What is that? What is the meaning of that particular point? Quantitatively means what? Suppose you are adding 1 ml of the precipitant, then here you have to get here 1 unit of the precipitate. Okay, so that means there is some here mathematical correlation between the amount of the precipitant you are going to add and the amount of the precipitate you are going to get. Is it clear? So, if at all such a mathematical correlation exists, then it will be very easy for us here to know how much amount of the precipitant we need to add here roughly. How much amount of the precipitant we need to add here to get or to for getting complete precipitation. We can have an idea about that. Okay. Second point, you see, precipitate must be formed with a reasonable amount of time. Is it clear? That means what? Within a very short period of time, okay, you should observe the formation of the precipitate. You should not wait for 1 day or, for example, 1 year to see the precipitate here formation to take place. Okay. Next is the solubility of the precipitate. This point is have to be very clear. The solubility of the precipitate should be low enough for quantitative separation. It should be slightly soluble than its amount left behind in the solution. Okay, should not exceed how much? 10 to the power of minus 6 mole. Okay. So when I have discussed with you the solubility product principle, I told you that silver chloride, you remember the point, silver chloride precipitate is formed. The silver chloride precipitate is a soluble precipitate only, no doubt. But if at all the quantity of the medium, okay, present is very less, then what will happen? The silver chloride precipitate will undergo ionization to a small extent, and it will be producing what? 1 silver ion and 1 chloride ion. Is it clear? Now there exists an equilibrium between silver ions and chloride ions and what? And AgCl. Okay, how much amount of AgCl is left out after ionization? 9 units of AgCl is left out. Is it clear? Because 1 unit of AgCl got converted into 1 Ag plus ions and 1 Cl minus ions. That means you can, by seeing this particular reaction or equation, you can say that the amount of AgCl present in the precipitate form is more when compared to the amount of AgCl present in what ionic form, or the amount of AgCl underwent or participated in ionization. Is it clear? So that should be the way. Otherwise, what will happen? We will not be able to here use this gravimetric procedure to find out the concentration of any given ion in a given unknown solution. Okay, suppose the precipitate which is formed, okay, is not sparingly soluble, but it is exhibiting high solubility in the given medium. Then what happens? Can you filter the precipitate? No, it is impossible. So under that condition, the gravimetric procedure will be of no use to estimate the amount of nickel or zinc or any other metal ion present in the given unknown solution. So you should always here ensure that the precipitate which is formed okay, in the gravimetric experiment, it is going to exhibit very, very less solubility in the medium. Is it clear? Then only it will be very convenient for the person who is doing the experiment, okay, to to separate or to filter the precipitate from the medium. Is it clear? How the point is clear to you?
Sir.
Yes. Now you see, weight form of the precipitate must be in the form of a stoichiometric variable form. Okay. So already I told you. So after removing the precipitate atmosphere from the medium, what you will do is sometimes atmosphere that precipitate should have what should have a perfect chemical atmosphere composition. It should have a definite chemical atmosphere formula, and that formula or that chemical atmosphere structure of the precipitate should not undergo atmosphere any kind of change. Is it clear? Sometimes, for example, the precipitation of barium as barium sulfate, but that practical is not here in our PG. Okay, PG. But there, what we do is after precipitating a barium as barium sulfate, we ignite that particular precipitate. Is it clear? We ignite that particular precipitate in a silica crucible. So after igniting, also, what should happen? There should not be any change in the chemical atmosphere composition, in the chemical atmosphere formula of that particular atmosphere barium sulfate atmosphere precipitate. Is it clear? Otherwise, what will happen? This particular gravimetric atmosphere analysis is of no use to estimate the amount of the metal ion present in the given unknown solution. Okay. Next is the particle size. You go to the next point. The particle size must be in such a way that they do not pass through the filtering medium and is unaffected by the washing process. Okay, let us see. So when we have done the gravimetric atmosphere experiment, we have done one process. What is that process? After adding the precipitant, I told you to heat the beaker containing the precipitate, and that process we call it as digestion. And during digestion, okay, what is happening is when you supply heat energy, what will happen? Collision is going to take place. Okay, before heating, if at all you observe the precipitate will be present in atmosphere in a jelly-like form. Okay, the jelly-like form. Okay, semi-solid form. Okay, semi-solid precipitate will not have any weight. Okay, it can easily pass through the pores present in the crucible. Okay, and you cannot filter it. Is it clear? Okay. So what you have to do? You have to increase the size of the precipitate. So when you increase the size of the precipitate, what happens? The nature or the texture of the precipitate will be converted from the colloidal atmosphere form into what form? Into the well-defined crystalline form. Is it clear? Crystalline form. So when the precipitate atmosphere in nature or texture is converted from the colloidal form into the crystalline form, automatically what happens? The size atmosphere increases. Size atmosphere increases. So when size increases, what will happen? It can no longer pass through the small pores of the gauge crucible, and hence you can easily here filter the precipitate. And not only that, what will happen when you heat or when you carry out the digestion process? What happens? The heat which you have supplied will be taken up by what? Will be taken up by the precipitate particles, and these precipitate particles are present in what form? In the colloidal form. Is it not? So colloidal form, already you have studied the colloidal lesson in your second BSc. Okay, there you might have studied that the colloidal atmosphere particles are very, very smaller in size. They can easily pass through the pores present in the filter paper, through the parchment membrane. All these things you have studied. Is it clear? So hence if at all the precipitate particles are present in a colloidal form, it is of no use for us. So what we have to do? We have to increase the size of the colloidal particles or the precipitate atmosphere particles present in what form? Colloidal form. So for that, what we are doing? We are giving heat energy. So when we give heat energy, this energy will be taken up by the precipitate particles present in what form? In the colloidal form. Okay. So these precipitate particles particles present in colloidal form, what will it do? Since it is having more amount of energy, it move in different directions, and during that process, it will collide with other with other precipitate particles, and finally what happens? One colloidal particle or one precipitate particle will combine with another precipitate particle. Thereby, what happens? The size of the precipitate particle increases, and that precipitate particle under its own weight will fall down. Where will fall down to the bottom of the beaker. That means what is happening? A precipitate particle which is having a colloidal dimensions is now converted into what? Into a solid form. A solid form means what? It should be naturally crystalline form only. Is it clear? So the size of the precipitate is a particle is increased, and when the size of the precipitate particle is increased, then what happens? Automatically the precipitate particle can no longer pass through the pores of the gauge crucible, and you can easily filtrate, and you can wash it. Is it clear? And you have to note one point. What is that? During the washing process also there should not be any change in the size of the precipitate particle. Okay, that means what? The precipitate particle should not contain any soluble components attached to it. If any soluble components are present attached to the precipitate particle, then what will happen when you add water when you wash it? What happens? That soluble component associated with the precipitate particle will automatically will be washed off. Okay, as a result of which what happens? The size of the precipitate particle decreases, and finally there is every danger for the precipitate particle to pass through the pores of the gauge crucible, and finally come out into the filter flask. Thereby under that condition what happens? Such precipitates, if it is formed, okay, then it will be of no use for us to estimate, or it will be very difficult for estimate the quantity of nickel or zinc or some other ions present in the given analyte solution. Okay, hope the point is clear to you.
Yes, sir.
Okay, the last point you see here. Okay, so let us stop for today. We will see the last 2 points in tomorrow's class. Okay. So give me your attendance. 1,
1 present, sir.
2,
Present, sir.
3,
Present, sir.
4,
Present, sir.
5,
Present, sir.